Good evening, everyone. Now, today's talk from the last shot to the last post will cover two things. The first part will be about a single day, 11 November 1918, the day World War One came to an end. But we're not going to cover the whole war or the months leading up to this day, just the one day. We'll go through what happened chronologically: the signing of the armistice in the early hours of the morning, the wait for it to take effect, and the moments the gun finally stopped at 11 a.m. Part two, which we'll cover later tonight, we will look at what came after this day, how remembrance is marked around the world, and how 11 November became a symbol of reflection and respect in different countries. Before we get to the signing of the armistice, let's just set the scene of that morning. The Western Front, which stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, was still very much active. The war had been raging for over 4 years. Millions of men had been killed or wounded. Entire landscapes had been torn apart by constant shelling. Forests were reduced to splinters. Towns flattened, and vast stretches of countryside had become wastelands of mud, wire, and craters. By November 1918, German forces were in full retreat. The Allied armies, made up of British, French, Belgian, American, and other troops, had pushed them back through a series of successful offenses over the previous 3 months. The German army was exhausted, short on supplies, and facing mutiny in its ranks. At home, revolution had broken out. The Kaiser had abdicated just 2 days earlier on 9 November, and a new German Republic had been declared. At 5:15 a.m. on the morning of 11 November 1918, the armistice was signed, the formal agreement to bring fighting to an end. The signing took place in a railway carriage in the forest of Compagnie, about 60 kilometers north of Paris. The site was chosen by the French for its privacy, the quiet, remote, and far from public attention. The carriage itself belonged to Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander. It had been converted into a mobile headquarters and was stationed on a siding in a clearing known as the Rotondas Clearing. Inside the carriage sat two delegations. On one side were the Allies, led by Marshal Foch, who was joined by General Maxime Weygand and Admiral Roslin Wemyss, representing Britain. Opposite them were the German delegates, led by Matthias Erzberger, a civilian politician from the German Centre Party. With him were General Detlev von Winterfeldt, Captain Ernst Vanselow, and Count Alfred von Oberndorf of the German Foreign Ministry. Erzberger had been sent by the new German government to secure peace, but in truth he had little choice but to accept whatever terms were placed before him. The Allies presented their terms with no room for negotiation. Germany would have to withdraw from all occupied territories, hand over thousands of guns and aircraft, surrender the entire submarine fleet, release all Allied POWs without demanding their own in return, and allow Allied troops to occupy key positions inside Germany. The signing itself was short without ceremony. At 5:15 a.m., Erzberger and Foch both signed the documents. Foch stood up and reportedly said just two words, "Tres bien," or very well. The agreement stated that the ceasefire would come into effect at 11 a.m., 6 hours later, to allow time for the orders to reach all parts of the front. But that meant the war was still not over. Fighting would continue along the lines for the rest of the morning, and tragically, many would still die before the guns fell silent. Even though the armistice had been signed, the war was clearly not over. The agreement stated hostilities would end 11 a.m., giving both sides only 6 hours to inform their frontline troops and begin the process of standing down. This time delay was built in to allow for communication. Remember, there was no mobile phones or emails. They had to send these messages by hand or telegraph. and many parts of the front were still under fire. But the reality was a lot more complicated. Across the Western Front, from the Belgian coast down to the Swiss border, fighting continued, not because no one knew what was happening. In many places, the commanders were fully aware of the armistice, but for several different reasons. In some cases, obviously, they were not informed yet. In others, local commanders offered final attacks to try and capture territory before the ceasefire took effect. Some believe that securing better positions now would help if the war restarted or peace negotiations failed. Others may have simply wanted to use the time they had left to try and finish what they had started. The result? Some of the most tragic fighting of the entire war happened in these 6 hours. Artillery batteries kept firing, infantry attacks were launched, patrols were sent out, and even tank units were still in operation. American forces in particular were involved in several engagements during these final hours. One of the most notable attacks was along the Meuse River, where elements of the US 89th Division were ordered to attack across the river at 9 a.m., even though the armistice was signed 4 hours before. The objective was a small town, and it was captured, but at the cost of more than 300 casualties. In some sectors, soldiers were told to hold their ground and not engage the enemy. In others, they were given clear orders. Some commanders refused to believe that the war was really ending. After all, many soldiers had seen similar rumors of peace before, only for them to turn out fake. What's especially tragic is that over 2,700 men are estimated to have been killed on 11 November 1918, almost all of them after the armistice was signed. Amongst those are 3 men: George Edwin Ellison, the last Brit to die in the war; Augustin Trebuchet, the last Frenchman killed in the war; and Henry Gunther, a 23-year-old American who is believed to be the very last soldier to die in the war at exactly 10:59 a.m., a few seconds before the guns fell silent. Gunther's death was especially tragic. He had reportedly charged a German machine gun post near the village of Chemont de Vandamvilliers. The German soldiers, knowing the war was ending in a couple of seconds, tried to wave him back, but he kept charging at them. They shot and killed him instantly. The Germans later said that they didn't want to fire at him at all, but they feared for their lives. At exactly 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. For many soldiers, it didn't feel real. Men who had spent years in constant danger suddenly found themselves staring across no man's land at enemies who, minutes earlier, had been trying to kill them, and now stood up, waved, or simply sat down and lit a cigarette. In some parts of the line, Allied and German troops even began approaching one another, just like the Christmas truce. Photographs taken later that day show men shaking hands, exchanging small items, and speaking sometimes through broken languages across the scars of the battlefield. The emotional response varied. Some soldiers cheered, others simply sat down in silence, overwhelmed by what had just happened. Many were too exhausted to celebrate. Some were even in shock. Officers tried to keep discipline in order, reminding their men that the war might not fully be over. The war wasn't technically won, it had only been paused. Peace treaties were yet to be signed, and orders were still in effect. In other places, the silence was eerie and unsettling. In the chaos of that last morning, I previously said that many people were killed. Some men who had been fighting since day one. As I mentioned earlier, Henry Gunther died 1 minute before the end of the war. His division received the news of the armistice a few minutes before he decided to do his suicidal charge. The last British casualty, George Ellison, had been killed early that morning. He had survived the entire war until his death in those final hours. and the French casualty was shot while carrying a message about the company's meal arrangements, reportedly telling the men that soup would be served after 11 a.m. All three of these men, and many others, are buried in cemeteries next to comrades who had died months or even years before. Their stories are reminders of how thin the line was between life and death, even on the last day. After 11 a.m., the Western Front completely changed. But beyond the front line, the reactions were completely different. In cities across Europe and the world, news of the armistice spread fast. In Paris, crowds gathered almost immediately. Church bells rang out, people sang in the streets. The French capital had suffered heavily throughout the war, and now it finally had a reason to celebrate. Flags appeared in windows, people embraced, and strangers shared wine and food. In London, a Big Ben rang for the first time since 1917. The streets were packed, people climbed statues, danced in Trafalgar Square, and cheered in front of Buckingham Palace as King George V appeared on the balcony with his family. For many Londoners, this was the moment they had been waiting for since August 1914. In New York, word of the armistice arrived in the early morning hours due to the time difference. As the sun rose over Manhattan, whistles blew, sirens screamed, and the crowds flooded Times Square. Office workers poured out into the streets. They were impromptu parades, bands, and people waving flags, even though the United States had only been in the war for over a little year and a half. But the relief was enormous. For the civilians, 11 November was a day of jubilation. For the soldiers, it was a strange mix of relief, exhaustion, and reflection. And that brings us to an end of part one of this talk, a close look at what happened on 11 November 1918 as it happened.